Hello, and welcome everyone tuning in. I'm Katya. I am a CEO and co-founder of the Inheritance Project, and I am so thrilled to be joined on this live by Deena Ismail, co-founder and co-CEO of the Listening Lab. The Listening Lab designs programs with community development and outreach at their core, and their projects invite discourse, develop soft connections, and contribute to a more resilient, interconnected society. And I'm really excited for us to dive into listening and this topic of listening, the connection between listening and leadership, especially with you, and to bring your unique perspective into the conversation. And I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and also to share any other details about your work with the Listening Lab and why you think listening is so important.
Yeah, I think, right, like my name is Deena Ismail, as Katya said, co-founder and CEO of Listening Lab. And I think, I was just sharing with Katya, I saw this thing the other day that says, shame dies when stories are told, right, in safe spaces. And so I think that is one of the biggest things that have inspired Listening Lab and why we do that, right? Like, I think it's so important for all of our stories to be shared, and that is how we develop connection with one another. And it is from whether it's through our inheritance or through our life experience or whatever we go through on a day-to-day basis, we all just want to be listened to, and not just our words, but everything we are wants to be listened to, right? And without shame, and to know that we are beautiful just the way we are and just the way we exist. And I think that is what's inspired everything we do, because we want to have a more interconnected society that feels like we can all live together and understand each other despite our difference, in spite actually of our differences.
Oh, such a beautiful answer right away. This is why I invited you to this conversation. We go deep immediately, and I really appreciate that because we don't have time nowadays to, stick in the small stuff and stay on the surface level. There's real leadership issues to solve in our economy, in our world. And I think that listening is a really underrepresented secret superpower in the world of leadership. And we inherit so many narratives about leadership and very few tools about how to really listen to each other. And, I want to back up for a second for those of you who may not be familiar with Inheritance Project and the word inheritance and the way we're using it. What we are talking about is not the physical items that you've inherited from your parents, grandparents, ancestors, but actually all of the invisible things that we inherit in this life, like our stories, our perspectives, our beliefs, our culture, the way that we are seeing the world. This is the subject that we help people, organizations unpack so that they can live a more conscious legacy. And because we are Inheritance Project, we often start by inviting people to bring an inheritance object to the table, something that represents your unique inheritance. And I invited you, Deena, to bring something that gives us a window into your background and your story and how your inheritance shaped Listening Lab, and all the work that you're doing today. So what did you bring? I'm curious.
So I'm wearing what I brought. I'm wearing this scarf, which is embroidery, Palestinian embroidery. In Arabic, we call it tatris. I am of Palestinian descent. Both my mother and father are Palestinian. This is actually my grandmother's, and she gave it to me. But this has often, our cross stitching has often been used even before 1948, when Palestine, with people of Palestine became displaced, was used as a way to the woman would use it to symbolize where they're from and their status and things like that. And it was passed on generation to generation as a way for a woman to not only be proud of where they are from, but to, as a source, it is currently being used as a source of income for our communities, right? And it's a thing that we hold with pride. And after 48, when, the flag was banned, the women started using the colors of the Palestinian flag through their cross stitching as a form of peaceful resistance, right? And so now it's just become a cultural symbol for us across the world as Palestinians to wear with pride. And I particularly hold this one with particular pride, because not only does it represent where I'm from and where my parents are from, but it also represents so much more. It represents our struggle, it represents our story, and the interwoven, how we are all connected through that, despite where we are in the world.
Mm, that's so beautiful.
Mhm.
And so can you share more with me about how you identify your unique identity? So this is representing your Palestinian culture, but I know there's more to the picture of who
Yeah.
is Deena. So I'd love to hear more.
I mean, there's so much that, right? On the surface, I would say I identify as a Palestinian American woman, who is culturally Muslim. Um, but on a deeper level, I kind of feel like I've inherited, you know, liberatory movements from every uh, cross of life, and understanding that liberation is our way to having a more interconnected world, right? And and I do that through arts, I do that through listening, I do that through storytelling is the most powerful tool. And I do that through sharing my story, listening to other people's stories. In whatever way we can find a place to connect is kind of how I identify who I am. I am a person who I feel like I can't say exactly what I am, because I have interacted with so many different beautiful beings of this world, and that has contributed to who I am today.
Absolutely. There's a metaphor we like to use of the difference between inheritance and identity, that our
Mm,
inheritance is like the clay that we're given when we're born. Like there's certain things about the clay that you have absolutely no choice over, right? The color of
mm,
the clay, where it's from, its origin,
mhm,
the early indelible marks made on the clay by life and our early childhood circumstances. And then our identity is how we're shaping the clay over the course of our life, and also how the clay is shaped by other people. Like you're
yeah,
saying, it's not just it's not fully ever in our complete control, because
mhm,
identity is a subject of perception, right? How we perceive ourselves and how other people perceive us or misperceive us,
mhm,
and the stories that we inherit about each other and about
mhm,
each other's cultures. And I think it's so beautiful that we get to meet in this way, in this dialogue, because my inheritance is that of post-Soviet Jewish refugee diaspora, of
mhm,
coming from also a culture that has liberation in its DNA and resistance, and also the inherited culture of the former Soviet Union and the complete repression of spirituality or any creed besides, government as God, essentially.
mhm,
Um, and it's so fascinating because, at least for me, I am reclaiming my connection to my cultures of origin
mhm,
through many narratives of what I could have been. If I was born 4 days after the Soviet Union fell apart, so I could have been born into the Soviet Union, which would have been its own identity, right? Its own kind of like an imperial identity, like whiteness, where it's like
yeah,
not doesn't actually mean anything. It's like
yeah,
a repressive cultural part, sort of. I wouldn't even say participation, like a forced cultural participation across many different countries. But I wasn't. I was born into Belarus. And then even just my reflection on the fact that I don't speak Belarusian, I speak Russian. I speak the language of the imperial oppressor that came and colonized
mhm,
Belarus. And then the Ashkenazi roots, which go all the way to the Pale of Settlement, which was all of modern day Belarus, parts of Latvia, Poland, Lithuania, all these different regional territories that were the Pale of Settlement, where all of the Ashkenazi Jews had their shtetls for so many years, right? And so I can't trace back to any particular place of origin. I'm sure that there's parallels in our stories coming from two cultures that are frequently pinned against one another in
mhm.
historically in the media. And I'm curious to hear about um, something that you inherited from your culture, of maybe it's a value, a belief, like maybe it is this culture of liberation that has helped you in your leadership journey.
You know, I'm gonna share a story, right? Um, so I went to a predominantly affluent white high school, where
Where was this?
in Toledo, Ohio.
Okay.
And, you know, my father's a refugee. My mother is first gen. And being Palestinian was kind of always a conversation in the home, right? And I was just like, I just want to be a white girl in school. Right? Just let me go, like, please, right? And then I went to college, where there was a large Palestinian, you know, liberal population of people who I kind of learned, right, how, right, it didn't feel like it was only my family kind of existing in that way, but I saw my peers existing in that way. And I, you know, became so proud of who I was, right? And I was able to really dig into the culture more and dig into, you know, I've always been not a politician, but rather a humanitarian, right? And so what does togetherness mean and how do we, you know, deal with that? But I have always remembered since a child feeling like I'm too much, right? Um, and not understanding where that comes from, right? Right. And that, you know, I'm too loud, I'm too passionate, I talk too much, my ideas are crazy, like all of these different things, right? You know, and some might say it's ADHD, but I think it's so much deeper than that, right? And then I graduated college, and my family said, "What do you want as your graduation gift?" And I said, "I want to go back home." And I
Mm,
hadn't been there, I don't know, since I was a kid. And my mom had taken my brother and I there when we were a kid. My dad, as a refugee, has actually never gone to Palestine. He's only grew up in the camps of Lebanon. So we went back. I went back after I had graduated college. And I was just sharing this story yesterday. Actually, I remember smelling the air.
mm.
And I remember hearing the people. And I remember sitting in the community of the people and saying, I am not too much. I am not too passionate. I actually, I am perfect just the way I am because these are my people and this is who we are. We we go full force for what we believe in, whether it's for our liberation as a people or whether it's to, you know, argue that you gave me the wrong grade on the test, right? Like, right? But, you know, and I feel like white supremacy has often tried to silence that part of who I am and tell me, like, right, fit the mold, walk this way, go this way, sit in the classroom this way. And Palestinians are such creative, beautiful people, right? And I more and more every day when I sit with like with myself, I am thankful for where I come from, right? So much of who I am is a result of my cultural inheritance, right? And the way that I mean, Palestinian women are some of the fiercest, if not the fiercest women I ever met. Um, you know, from my mother to my grandmother to my aunts, like I have never seen such fierce women in my life, and that was passed down from generation to generation to generation. We will not be silenced for being proud of who we are,
Absolutely.
and that can resonate in whatever work we do and what in whatever way we exist in this world.
Mm, wow. We're 13 minutes in. You've already made me cry. I resonate so deeply with this feeling of too muchness. And it's really interesting because, you know, maybe someone seeing us in conversation would be like, not expecting me to resonate with this as a white, blonde, blue-eyed woman who did grow up in the United States. Meanwhile, I felt like I look like I belong and I'm supposed to know all the cultural rules and I'm supposed to behave in this cultural way, but I am the opposite of this culture. And my house is also loud and too much and full of trauma and resistance and rebellion and, you know, all of these things that I felt like I was carrying within me and that everyone was perceiving me completely not like I experienced myself and my
Mhm.
culture, which I think is actually a truth a lot of people feel and might feel kind of embarrassed to talk about of like I don't feel like I fit the norm that I'm supposed to, you know, exhibit or behave like in the culture I'm being socialized in. And also what really hit me was your feeling of coming home because I will say that I always, it's the third culture kid problem. I'm not Belarusian enough to be Belarusian. I'm not American enough to be American. I'm some
Preach.
third in between culture
Yeah.
that I create, and then I meet other third culture people, and that's my community. I resonate with the in-betweeners, this feeling that you're always in belonging and not in belonging at the same
Mhm.
and that challenge, the reality of the grief that's associated with not feeling
Mhm.
like you have a home, and also the gift of
Mhm.
being someone who can observe and fit in so many different places. And I think we are forced to listen in a different way when we're not being socialized in our culture of origin.
Mhm.
And I want to talk about that a bit,
Mhm.
right? About what you started to learn about listening, coming from a culture that, what is listening like in your culture of origin? What are the stories about listening? Are there any? And how did you come from this, feeling of like, I need to be heard and listened to recognizing the power of listening?
I mean, right. I think there's two. I'm gonna go back to, I was just in Ohio. I got back today, and yesterday I was sitting around the dinner table with my dad, and he was sharing with me story after story after story after story about growing up in the camps, right? And, you know, I was like, I didn't have my phone next to me, and my mom walked by and she said, are you recording? Normally, I like, especially for what I do, I should be recording, right? But the power of shit, like, right, as I've gotten older and I've listened to story, I've understood that it's all the answers are not only through the telling, but how the story is being shared, right? People might have this view about who we are, whether it is as third, I forget what they're called again,
Third
third
culture
third
kids.
culture kids, I know it, or or being a refugee, or being a woman of color. They might have their narratives, right? But when you sit down and just provide space for the story to be shared, and not just the words, but you look at the energy surrounding it, right? I made up this idea in my head for such a long time that while things were very hard for my dad growing up, he said to me, I really miss those days, right? The idea, the way that the community cared for itself. He was telling me about this fight that his brother got in, and he said the police didn't intervene. They relied on the community to take care of themselves. And there was trust in how we listened to the community's needs. And we trusted, because of the listening that happened, that the community could heal itself,
Yeah.
right? And so I think there's so much power in listening to the things that are not said, but are the things that we just witness, whether it's through body language, whether it's through intonation of voice, whether it's through eye contact, right? Only 7% of listening is actually done with our words, right? And so what are we missing?
Hmm.
And we really only hear, I read the statistic the other day, we actually really only listen to 17 to 25% of the things we hear.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah.
I love knowing that. And I love the way that you said it, that listening, we often hear it the inverse, right? More than 80% of our communication is nonverbal, but so is our listening. And I think this is something not often talked about. Like, you hear about the idea of listening being like, yeah, I'm using my ears, right? I'm listening to the words being spoken. But how do you physically listen, right? What does that feel like energetically? Because, like you're saying, it is an energetic thing. Like, you can tell when someone is even performing listening, but they're not really listening to you,
Mhm.
right? Which is something that a lot of us are socialized to do. And I'm guilty of too, right? Someone's talking, oh, I got a text message and now I'm listening to you, but I'm not listening to you anymore. And the signal that sends, like, we often don't notice how our micro behaviors in a certain moment send certain messages to the person that we are supposedly listening to, right?
Mhm.
And I'm curious, okay, just to pivot slightly, and then we'll come back to this listening conversation. I'm curious if there's anything that you feel you inherited, an inherited belief or behavior that actually you recognized was holding you back from leadership or listening.
I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword. I just talk about the power of being a woman and our passion, but under the white supremacist context and trying to assimilate to this country and all of these things, it has, even though the family put that in me to be passionate, there was also an inherited undertone from a larger community sense, like women don't do this. My family was breaking the barrier for being in leadership within our community, right?
Yeah.
But you're not career driven. Have your family, get married, and that should be the goal, right? And so, like, these beliefs, I've struggled with that my entire, and like, am I doing the right thing? I'm a creative at the end of the day, right? And
Mhm.
is that it's an inherited belief that that's not going to lead to my success, right? Whether financial success or whatever success that is, because it's not a secure future. And of the you know because of being a child of immigrant, what we understand is secure futures. You're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. Was that pushed upon me? Not necessarily, but it was throughout my community what was seen as successful, right? And so I often was asking myself, am I doing the right? But my intuition wouldn't allow me to do something. But it took me a long time to get to this place where I'm like, you know what? I don't care. I don't care. This is what feels right to me, and I'm going to listen to my body and what feels good in my body to do that. But the inherited beliefs about what success looks like and how to properly even now lead a team, right? How to lead a team of, like, you know, right? Don't get too close. Don't ask too many questions because you're not their therapist, right? But connection is the way we build culture, and connection is the way we build strong teams.
You just illustrated the exact nuanced belief that we often aren't aware is keeping us from the real connection that we could make with the people on our team and the people around us. That the very topics we're socialized to think we shouldn't be talking about are the very things that connect us. And even this conversation, this experience, you saying, of course, the immigrant narrative, become a doctor, become a lawyer, become an engineer. I find I've spoken to a lot of immigrants. I find this is a connective narrative for people who are in a country that already you feel unstable. You're in an unstable, uncertain society, right? So of course you inherit these ideas that are really survival ideas. And I think there is this really strong connection between the beliefs that were handed down generation to generation out of survival, out of this intention of this is going to help you survive. But so often those inherited survival beliefs are what keep us from thriving, right? They keep us from the life that we really want to live, the creative pursuit, art as necessity rather than privilege, right? All of the things that we recognize are actually our soul wants it, or if you don't resonate with that terminology, just this feeling of like there's got to be more than this, right? That we're socialized to ignore. And that's so sad to me because actually that feeling is what unites us no matter what culture we come from, right? So again, it's like this invisible territory that we so often don't dare to enter into. That's actually the connective tissue that lets us see each other as humans and as people who are all overcoming these different inherited beliefs, right, in our own
Mhm.
lifetime. And there's a question in the chat that I want to ask you, which is, it's interesting to understand how your past made your personality and your commitment. So my question is, so you inherited this narrative, whether it was verbally told to you or not,
Mhm.
right? Whether it was just culturally understood that
Mhm.
this is what's expected.
Mhm.
So are there any specific things you can point to that helped you transform that belief within yourself, or that, motivated you to be a cycle breaker or rebel against this? There's this phrase that I was told that has been really sitting with me. I don't know if I fully agree with the word choice, but something about it is very truthful to me, that all progress requires betrayal to a
Mm-hmm.
degree.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about that, right? Like, what did you have to betray culturally to live the life that you're currently living?
I had to let go of caring about what anybody thinks, right? That's actually a really inherited belief that we have to maintain, a certain level of, whether it's politeness, whether it's diction, whether it's how to act as a lady, whatever it is, to be credible, right? And I had to let all of that go, right? And I think when there's something that came to mind even before you asked this, and I forgot to share it, when you talked about what is something you inherited that has like been a place of strength beyond the passion, is the importance of community and the lack of individualism, right? So much in this country pushes us to be individuals, right? Your healing needs to be individualistic so that you can support the collective. You don't just heal for yourself, you heal to support the collective. And that has been something ingrained in me from the beginning. I can't be of service, right? I started, I don't even remember now, 15 years ago doing youth work, because my young adult life was turbulent for me. So I think that's how I found healing, through
Mm,
myself. And if I think about what was the largest lesson I took from that, was the importance of the collective working together while we are working on ourselves to support the young people, right? Through whatever, by any means necessary, even if that meant there were plenty of times where I wasn't liked for my opinion, right? Plenty of times. But to me, everybody always has a seat at what I like to call the family table, right? There are times where you might have to take accountability, but it makes no use to any of us to say, well, you did this thing, so I'm done with you altogether. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but like, I think there's just like so much there about, if there's one thing, I can't say there's just one moment in my life. I can say it was going to college, going
mhm,
going to Palestine, working in youth development, at this place called The Door for 9 years of my career, right? Learning that, my mom put me in arts, dance and theater as a young person, and then refinding it as an old person, as an older individual, and being like, we all need to find that level of child in us to actually allow us to listen to ourselves and listen to others to create collective healing.
mm. What I'm hearing and what you're sharing is the risk of someone not liking your opinion or the
Mhm.
way that you are pursuing your passion in the world
Mhm.
is much lower than the risk of maintaining the status quo and keeping things the way they are. And when that risk of things staying the same is greater than the risk of that person doesn't like me, or I need to rebel against this certain cultural narrative, that's when we really have a chance to recognize that we are safe enough in this current moment to handle someone not agreeing with us.
Mhm.
And that is a sign of progress
Mhm.
socially, right? And especially our privilege as people who live in America.
Yeah.
Because it's, this advice is, I hear this and I feel it as well. And I need to acknowledge, right, that I couldn't give this advice to someone who would fear for their life if they spoke their truth.
Of
And
course.
this is why it's so incredible. Like, I return to this phrase that I am my ancestors' wildest dream. And
Mhm.
I really feel that,
Mhm.
especially in my cultural inheritance, where my great grandmother wanted to be a performer and all of her teachers were murdered by Stalin's repression, right? I
Mhm.
mean, when being an artist was dangerous, when saying what and it's still true in so many different places in the world.
Yep.
And so it's this double-edged sword of, these are the very things we need to live the life we want, and we have to be safe enough to actually pursue life in this way, right? So, and how do we, as the people with this privilege here, do the work to create those circumstances in more places in the world? I mean, that becomes the question of the work. And I want to actually bridge this conversation, because I think what you brought up, there's so many things you brought up that are connected to listening and leadership. And I think that listening is especially important when we are having a conflict, right? When it's important, sure, for relationship and friendship and for being a good person in the world. But when it really comes into play and becomes like the differentiator, the difference between, is this going to result in connection or is this going to result in war? This is where I really think listening starts to play a more critical, essential piece in our lives, and also what we inherited around listening through conflict, in conflict, right? How does dialogue, how does listening, how can we do this? How can we still listen, right? Or listen to someone that we either historically are in conflict with culturally, or literally in conflict with, right? Directly. I'm curious what you think. What does it really mean to listen? And then if you could talk about the role of listening in conflict and your experience with it.
Well, I think first and foremost, as I just talked about, the healing of the self to support the collective, right? What does it mean to listen? It means to first listen to yourself, right? Where do you feel it in your body? Where, right? Your body has a, right? Your body always reacts before your brain. So even if you're trying to talk your brain out of it, where are you feeling it in your body when you are about to, right, listen to a situation? And what is the intention? Are you coming with a preconceived notion of what you are listening for? Right? It's kind of like mindfulness, right? Like, how do you just kind of let the thoughts kind of pass you by, right? Rather than just saying like, let me make meaning out of each thought that I have, right? And that's the same. How do we just listen to be present, right? And so how do we make that, agreement with ourselves? And so that first starts with ourselves. How do we not judge ourselves? Because like you said, we are a compilation of everything we have inherited and experienced and all of these things. And our biggest our biggest saboteur is ourself, right? And so oftentimes I often say this: if somebody is triggering you, you might want to go look in the mirror. You might want to go look in the mirror, because, right, more often than not, the things that trigger you about another individual is something you don't like about yourself. Yeah. Right. And so how do you become compassionate to yourself? Because it will make it so much easier to become compassionate to other people, right? For example, like I said, like sometimes I talk too much, right? And so, that's actually, as much as I like to talk, it's an insecurity of mine, right? And so then when somebody's like going on a long tangent, I'm just like, oh God, come on, right?
Yep.
But the reality is I'm actually judging myself for doing the same.
I mean, and this is really deep. This is a deep insight. This is deep wisdom that I think not everyone is fully prepared to integrate. I think we do need to move through feelings of anger, right? Yeah. About the situation, in order to recognize that what I'm rejecting in this other person is actually the part of myself that I reject the most, right? The part of myself, whatever I'm judging in the other person is essentially the idea that all judgment is self-judgment at the end of the day. However, it's so nuanced, right? Because sometimes the triggering event feels like, how do you bring this into awareness for yourself when, let's say, you're experiencing, violence, or, I love this insight, and I also am curious about your perspective on this. Of that is true, and is there an objective, this is wrong, this person needs to be, so like I'm talking about cancel culture, for example. I'm
Yeah.
really curious your perspective on cancel culture and accountability, because I think there's this very nuanced conversation around this that isn't being had. We have kind of two camps. Canceling is how we hold people accountable, and canceling is the very problem, right? There's this sort of
Yeah.
nuanced dialogue around this. So I'm curious about your insight on this. How do we both understand that all judgment is self-judgment and also effectively hold people accountable?
Boundaries, right? I mean, that's easier said than, I mean, I just made it sound so simple. Right? Set boundaries. No, but in all seriousness, right? Like back to that family table concept I put up, right? Cancel culture, for I don't know who's going to disagree with me here, so I'm sorry, but cancel culture actually is, it separates us. It doesn't leave room for us to understand. Sometimes understanding is really hard, and I'm not like, right, I'm not saying like I wake up every morning and I don't feel angry, right? There's so much anger that I still hold, and there are times that I still, I used to be a very, very angry person, and I've gone through a lot of healing work, and I'm still not close to the end of whatever that journey is, right? But the idea that like I understand that if I was understood, maybe I wouldn't feel so put out. Maybe I would have felt more welcome. So if I want that for myself, I need to implore that thought process on what I interact with, right? Even if that means I have to take the boundary for a second and say, I can't engage in this right now, right? Whether it's through, like, I've had employees of mine that just, like really put me through the ringer. And I've had to learn and say, I'm not ready right now.
Oh,
Right.
yes.
But I don't think, and I want to say, I don't think you are bad. I need to always remind them, just because I'm not ready doesn't mean I think you're bad.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that I can be present to the entire listening experience with you, and even be vulnerable enough to share with you from the onset what I'm experiencing. Like, hey, I feel angry at you. And yes, some of it has to do with you, but I also recognize that this is a trigger inside of me and I'm working through it, but I want us to come to a place of healing together so we can work better together. Vulnerability is the key.
Beautiful. I wish I'm gonna rewatch this conversation. We're gonna pull out that script, because I think that these are the scripts, these are the words that we're not given, we're not taught throughout our life. How do I eloquently hold a boundary with care? How do I hold what I need and also create the space for us to find understanding through this conflict? There's so much that's required for that kind of care. And what you're talking about is the first skill in Inheritance Project, 7 skills for challenging conversations. We call it pause and breathe. What you just said of, I'm recognizing I'm triggered. That's the first step, right? The first step is the somatic awareness. Like you said, where do you feel it in your body? Oh, I'm feeling in my body that I am moving from the space of my prefrontal cortex where I can listen, engage, problem solve, empathize, and I'm having cortisol and adrenaline coursing through my body. I am not in that moment. I need to have the awareness that I am moved out of the listening space, right? I feel like there's the space of listening and there's the I can't listen right now space, and that both are necessary, and our nervous system cycles up regulates and down regulates. So if we're in an upregulation in a triggered moment, we cannot actually find solution in that space. And I think this is a truth that we resist as humans. We feel this urgency to resolve now, this inherited idea that all things must be fixed right when they are, experiencing tension or conflict. And really, our greatest gift is to put space between the incident, the triggering event, and returning to being able to understand, listen, and find the common ground together. And in that space between is pausing, regulating the nervous system, and then separating out the observations from the story I'm telling myself. So something that you were talking about observing the thoughts while you're listening, right?
Mhm.
This ability, this is a muscle, right? It's something that we need to train, which is why I think the work you do with the listening lab is so essential. It's a relational skill that we cannot practice by ourselves in our bedroom or even with our therapist. It's a relational skill that we need to practice in community around the table, to say, just like I strengthen my muscles in the gym so I can have a resilient body, I need to work my listening muscle, my
Mhm.
understanding muscle. And in order to do that, I need to be clear on what actually happened that triggered me, the neutral observation of what
Mhm.
happened, versus all of the stories I told myself about what happened,
Mhm.
about the other person, about the incident, about the unfairness, about, whatever I'm creating, the meaning making I'm creating from the incident that occurred. And I think that this is a skill that really requires practice, and we don't have enough spaces to practice this. So this is all why we're doing
Mhm.
our upcoming leadership course. If you're listening to this and saying, I want a space to practice listening and to practice these skills, I will share more about that at the end of this live with you. I'd love to have you in the community, but I want your perspective on what I just shared as well, because I think these are how do we practice this, right? Tell us more
Mhm.
about how you approach this with the listening lab.
You know, I often, with the listening lab, and, you know, through the listening lab and in general, through myself and through others, I often, when we're in a heightened place, we first check our body, we do a body scan, right? And we do take the space you need there, right? In restorative and transformative practices, space is actually necessary for healing,
Mhm.
right? Like we need to take space if our body is telling us we need to. And then I say, check the facts. Check the facts, right? And some of us can do it in our brain, like just like this, and say, like, okay, what happened? He said this, I said this, then this happened. Right? Some of us need to write it down. Some of us need to dance it out. Whatever it is to process what the actual facts were. Now let's look at the facts. What is true about those facts? And what did that, and back to what you said, what meaning did I make out of those facts? Right? And why did it feel that way? Right? Was it his tone of voice or her tone of voice? Or right? For me, tone of voice is a huge trigger. I know that. Body language affects me, but tone of voice for me is a very, so I can say, like, okay, they said, you know, I have this weird thing with I don't like my name at the end of a sentence, right? Like, okay, Deena. I'm like, they're mad at me. Where does that come from? Let's check that, because all the person said was, okay, Deena. And maybe their intonation went up and down, and maybe they're frustrated, maybe they're not, maybe that's the way they talk, maybe it's not. But how do we even know if we just decide that that's what it meant based off of whatever experiences we have or whatever preconceived notions we have about this individual or this collective or wherever it is? What happened to them to have that reaction, right? Everything takes approaching it with compassion and empathy. You have your own story and why you're reacting this way, so does the person that you're talking to. And so hopefully both of us can have these skills, but one of us at least needs to, right? I often do this exercise with, I did it with some young people we just worked with, telling them to kind of determine if they were fire, if they were earth, they were water, all of these different things. And if you meet fire with fire, what happens? Like a fight is about to happen,
Yeah.
right? I'm a really fiery person, I know that, but maybe I need to check in with my earth self if somebody's approaching me with fire,
Mhm.
because their wrists will loosen up, their fists will loosen up because they don't feel a threat.
Yeah,
If you
and actually there's a whole neurological component of what's going on, because it's so fascinating. It's like the very thing that is challenging about communication is also what makes it so beautiful. That our Because so much of what we're communicating isn't verbal, it's physical and through the nervous system, it really only takes one person to change something, to
Mhm.
break a pattern, to break a conflict pattern between two people or a group, or to downregulate someone's nervous system. So if you are noticing that someone is becoming activated, which you often can tell through tone of voice, right, and through all these
Mhm.
other things that you pick up on, that you sense, something's off here, and you can notice that their nervous system is upregulating. This is why the deep breathing, right, and keeping ourselves grounded, the earth energy, actually staying in a more aware, regulated nervous system space will make their mirror neurons go off in their brain, and they will actually start to down regulate with you. This is also why we need co-regulation sometimes, or we need
Mhm.
other people to help us when we are very upregulated,
Mhm.
because just even having like, and you can do it for yourself. So one of my favorite tools that I'll share is, if you notice yourself becoming activated,
Mhm.
so often what's happening is everything's like moving up into the meaning making and away from
Mhm.
our physical awareness. Skin to skin contact. So if you're able to put a hand on your chest
Mhm.
in that moment, you'll notice that you'll start to deepen your breath, and that your
Mhm.
nervous system will remember, I'm still safe in my body.
Mhm.
Even though this other person is maybe angry, or getting anxious, or I sense this nervous energy in my interaction, I can stay grounded in this myself. I can stay safe to the degree that I'm able to. And if I'm not, to use the beautiful script that you offered us in this, right? I'm recognizing I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling, angry, uncomfortable, triggered, and I am not able to listen right now in the way I would need for us to continue this interaction.
Mhm.
Right? And I have the intention of coming back to it. So I think that this is the other nuance. And I'm curious to also give you, have a few wrap up questions here, because this has been such a beautiful conversation. Um, it's important that we name that we're going to give a time to return to it as well,
Mhm.
right? Because so many people say, yeah, I set a boundary. I'm not able to talk right now. And then I walk away, and then the other person won't honor my boundary and they're following me. Like, I'll share a story. I know in my life, I'm an anxiously attached person that inherited the fight response rather than the freeze or flight or anything else. And so I have that urgency that I recognize comes up in me when like the email is sent that I want to respond to, right? Or whatever. So I've had to really recognize when my physical body is doing things I'm not consciously aware of, like this person is now moving away from me and I'm following them. This is one of the sure signs that they, in that moment, are not able to, with their words, communicate that they can no longer hold space
Mhm.
for the interaction between us. And I'm not aware that I am not able to let go of it either. And I think that so often the words that are missing there are, I need to pause this, and this is when we can return. Let's find
Mhm.
a time to return to this conversation. Because without that piece, it can also feel like abandonment, right? Or
Mhm.
any of the other things that we're not trying to do when we're trying to take space.
Mhm. Yeah. I think, I think it's really important within all these fight, flight, freeze, fawn, all these things, in the anxious attachment, the disorganized attachment, all of these things to, I could easily say I'm like either anxious attachment or disorganized attachment. Um, but to not typecast ourselves even in that, because the, oftentimes I think right. I just said I'm a fire, but depending on the situation, depending on what I've inherited, right? If I'm dealing with, you know, a a white man, I actually might fawn or freeze instead of fight.
Hmm.
If I'm dealing with my mother, I'm going to fight.
Absolutely.
Right? If I'm dealing with a place where I know I'm safe, I will go to to that
Mhm.
response. So number one, to be aware that all of these things are normal and responses to the things we've experienced throughout our lives, right? And to not pathologize yourself either,
Absolutely.
and not to pathologize the other, right? And I think it's so, but the time frame as a person in general who is more anxious than any of the others, other types of attachment, I need that time frame, and it's not only the good thing to do, but it's actually professional, right? Like if you want to think about
Mhm.
professionality, if you want to lead a team of trust, you can't have anything you can't have a good team unless you, right? The foundation is trust,
Absolutely.
right? on not only like trust on a really deep level, like I trust this person deeply cares about my well-being. They don't need to know everything about my life, but that they deeply care what happens to me outside of what I produce. Right? And so that means, number one, starting with a space of listening to understand the person as a person. Entering conversations with, what would you do this week? Oh, I really like doing that too. Or I like, right? Understanding the things that make them happy, make them sad. And don't shut that out if it has nothing to do with what's going on in that, right? That small talk piece is actually where the most important listening happens.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Because then when you get into conflict, like we just talked about, and you need that space, and you say, hey, Katya, I need space right now, but I'm going to get back to you, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. You don't even need to say time, but at 10 o'clock, let's put something on the calendar. Because we have that strong foundation of trust and I care about you as a person, I'm not even just brushing you off and telling you like, okay, she's going to talk to me tomorrow at 10. And I have no idea what that's going to be about. But I know that I want to approach you with compassion. I hope that you can understand that I care about our relationship on much more than a productivity level. I care about you as a person. And so even before we think about the conflict, we need to think about what is the environment of listening we're creating beyond what the production is that your staff is or whomever is supposed to produce for you.
And if you're listening to this thinking, this doesn't exist in my workplace, the trust, the care, the actual space for listening, that is an opportunity, right? To actually have conversations with the people that you work with. It's so easy for us to fall into, like you're saying, the meaning making. They don't care about me. I observed this behavior. So something I didn't bring up was that, we see behavior, tone of voice, or whatever we're seeing, but we're not seeing all the things underneath, the needs, the stories, the challenges, the context, everything else that was happening for that person, right? And so often we just reduce each other to these minimal exchanges or the culture that we're in without seeing that actually most people are open to real dialogue if we're actually making that invitation. And instead of sitting around waiting for your leadership to do that, this is how you become a leader. This is what real leadership is. This is saying, I care enough to build trust in my team. I care enough to be the person that says, let's get to know each other a little bit deeper, right? And I think that also some places, some organizations, they really need training and tools for this, right? Because it can be really hard for it to happen just from the inside with the existing dynamics of the team. And this is why mediation is so important. Sometimes we need an outside container, right? We would, and absolutely what Ismet's saying here, we would benefit from assuming positive intent. Oh, what a wonderful nugget to take away from this conversation, because I don't think real listening can happen until we empty ourselves of the stories that we have about each other and say, how would I want to be approached? Like, do you want to be approached in such a way that the person you're talking to doesn't assume you're coming from a good place? Probably not, right? You're like, I'm coming from a good place. Well, everyone's operating from that way of thinking, right? And so it's sort of like we forget to extend the truth we experience to other people. And so what would happen if we do assume positive intent? What would happen if we catch ourselves when the meaning making we make is catastrophic, which we are conditioned to do, right? Oh, I observed this behavior, they hate me. This is like the leap that we make is to this like extreme narrative that would be so much easier for us actually than the nuanced complexity of what's really going on, right? But it's in that nuanced complexity that we find understanding and connection and all the other things that real collaboration is made of, effective collaboration. So it's such a joy to talk to someone who is resonating and sharing this all back to me. And in terms of building trust, so I want to share some tools. How can you access us in other ways? How can we support you to become a better listener, right? And to bring this kind of trust building to your community and your teams. I want to offer you a chance to share about the Listening Lab and how people can get involved with your work, because we're coming down to our last 5 minutes of conversation. And then I also want to share with those listening, how can you be part of our community where we practice these skills for having hard conversations, these skills that are so often the difference between whether we build trust or we fall into disagreement and disconnection. And I know we both share a love for the sustained dialogue methodology. And
Mhm.
I just want to offer this sentence of deep listening is listening deep enough that you can be changed by what you hear. Listening deep enough that you are open to be changed by what you're hearing, right?
Mhm.
This is a different framework from which we can discern, am I really ready to listen to this person or not?
Mhm.
Right? Or do I have more work to do until I
Mhm.
actually can come to the conversation from that place? So I'm curious, how can people find you, practice listening, get involved with the listening lab if they want to? And then I'll share a little bit as well.
Yeah. So first and foremost, if you want to learn more about the Listening Lab, you can go to listeninglab.nyc, and kind of look at our website and see. We do everything from exhibition and research, community action, education, and incubation, and we are a very like customized approach to what each community needs. Back to, we are here to listen to what the community needs, and we co-create the process with you, right? There's not, yes, we do have a way of doing things, and we train people on listening and how to listen, and we have a curriculum we follow. However, we are here to create that experience to your personal needs, your company's needs, the clients you serve needs. And so you can find us there. You can also, reach out to me personally at Deena at listeninglab.nyc, and I would be happy to connect with you. And you can find us on Instagram at listeninglabnyc.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we'll make sure that it is sent in the replay email as well so that you can connect with Deena online and offline and in real life. And if you are interested in learning the 7 skills for challenging conversations and upleveling your leadership, and something that you understand would help not just you in your work, but also potentially in your partnerships, relationships, friendships. We have a 10-week leadership immersion that's starting September 11th. And because you are all on this live, you get a bonus discount if you're interested. And yes, I'm going to put the banner up here so you can see how you can find out all about this. And if you are listening, you can get an extra $100 off of our early bird price with the code LinkedIn100. And I'm going to send all this out in a follow-up email as well. If you're curious and you have questions, please reach out to me directly, Katya at inheritanceproject.org. I would love to support you. We have discounts for groups, for nonprofits. We can work out payment plans. This 10-week immersion is going to connect you with a group of people all working on a real life challenge or conflict. And through the 10 weeks, we're going to learn the 7 skills for challenging conversations and get to practice them together. So actually having practice conversations before we're out there needing to do it in the real world. So I'm really excited for that. And I hope that Deena will also be there. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that she'll have space to be a part of the cohort too. So you'd also get direct access conversation just like this, in a space that's intentional and held. And our vision as Inheritance Project is to really bring these conversations about what we are inheriting that's holding us back. And also, what are we inheriting that's moving us forward? How do we hold both of those? How do we understand what we do need to let go of collectively and individually so that we can build the kind of world we want to live in? Because it's one thing that's clear to me at the end of this conversation is that some of the beliefs we inherit around how we should engage in conflict, what we should and shouldn't say, how we should behave, they often hold us back from the very connection that we want to have with other people. And we need to be willing to do the work and actually look at what are we rejecting in ourselves that we're rejecting in others that could be transformed into connection. So I'm so grateful for you, Deena, for joining me for this conversation. Is there anything you want to say that you want people to take away from this in our last minute?
No, I think just be present to yourself, be present to others, and listen with more than just your ears. Listen with your whole heart, your whole body. And then and only then will this world see collective liberation.
Mm, so beautiful. Thank you so much. I cannot wait for more conversations with you. We'll have to have you back. Part 2 is coming. Part 2 is coming. And if you wanna get the replay, make sure you're registered for this live, and you'll get the replay and all of the links we just mentioned in your inbox tomorrow. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day, and I want you to go find someone in your life that you are ready to listen to right now. If you're inspired by this conversation, go think of that person that you could say, "Hey, I'd love to have lunch and just hear your story." And maybe if you're willing to have it be someone you think you have a story about, that's going to be the most powerful listening session of your week. So I hope that you can take that inspiration into your life right now. And thank you so much, Deena. Till next time.
Thank you.